to add further to this explanation for the cause and cure for manic depression bipolar, I need to again focus your attention on lactose intolerance and glucose intolerance. People with glucose intolerance, when they consume glucose, they suffer stomach cramps. And so they realize this and know that they must avoid glucose in order to avoid the stomach cramps. And the same can be said for people suffering with lactose intolerance. They know that if they consume dairy products with lactose inside, they then suffer the symptoms of having that intolerance to lactose. They can sometimes have runny noses or flatulence and stuff like that. And it's widely accepted culturally and on a societal level that these intolerances exist genetically within people. And so society has created medicines and diets to help these people integrate into society with a healthy body and mind. When it comes to yeast, however, it's a different story, and the reason for that is an historical reason. The historical reason is this, simply explained. There are two types of people suffering from a yeast intolerance. The first and most commonly accepted type is alcoholics. Alcoholics are suffering from yeast intolerance. The second most common form of people suffering from yeast intolerance is manic depression bipolar. People who are manically depressed are suffering from a yeast intolerance. The problem with people in the new millennium is that society has convinced itself that this intolerance doesn't exist anymore. It's probably one of the greatest deceits in the modern age, that people in the West have developed a tolerance to this disease, to this bacterial infection. And that's because we've been educated and taught that hundreds and thousands of years of consuming bacterial yeast-based products has given us an immunity to these diseases, to the infections. And it's widely often accepted that Native Americans and Native Africans have an intolerance to alcohol-based products because they have not got as rich and as deep a history of consuming yeast-based alcohols. And many Africans accept that fact. Many Native Africans accept the fact that they have a lower tolerance to alcohol than many Western Europeans, just Europeans in general. And many Native Americans and people native to the Americans accept the fact that they have a lower tolerance to alcohol than people from the Western cultures of Europe. And that may have been true previously, that they had a lower tolerance compared to us in the West, who are European ethnicities. But with the advent of antibiotics and their wide use of them in Western culture, for often the most minor of ailments, what has resulted is that people who in the past had lineages that were intolerant to yeast became tolerant to the yeast over time. But now that antibiotics are making, and the use of topical creams for combating the infection, the bacterial infections, it's creating a mutated and stronger yeast infection. So what's happening is that antibiotics that are being used to treat other diseases, other infections, it's mutating and creating stronger strains of the bacterial infection virus, let me rephrase. Antibiotics are strengthening the yeast bacteria. And over time, the yeast bacteria are becoming more stronger. And because they're becoming stronger, they're beginning to affect the people that were historically who are from lineages historically weak and intolerant to yeast, which is why in the new millennium there are a lot more people beginning to suffer with mental health problems, because all of a sudden the yeast bacteria is strengthening and is causing manic depression on a much grander and wider scale, especially now that society has developed or degraded, depending on how you look at it, into a state of people have more sexual intercourse with strangers. People drink more heavily. Females drink more heavily than in the past. All of these things combined with the strengthening of the bacterial yeast as a result of using antibiotics, it's all combining to create a kind of a plague. It's an underlying plague. It's a suppressed plague because society psychologically doesn't want to accept that yeast is becoming a problem again. We're more comfortable to just continually accept that it's something that we're now immune to, even though it's very obvious to many people that the bacteria is strengthening and mutating and becoming more of a problem for society. And it's true, it's a huge problem for society. Most people suffering from homelessness, often you'll see them sitting on the side of the road, talking to themselves, feeling utterly lost, completely lost, alone, helpless. And very frequently you'll see them with alcohol. They'll spend their beggings on alcohol. Those are the poor alcoholics. Those are the homeless alcoholics. You also have the richer alcoholics, the ones that sit at home all day drinking wine after work every single night. There's also the more middle-class alcoholics who you'll sometimes see in a pub just drinking on their own continuously. And what's happening to them is, instead of becoming manically depressed, they've become functioning alcoholics. The yeast intolerance is the same. It's the same thing happening to them. But instead of consuming the sugars and waiting for the sugars to form into ethanol poisoning, they're just superseding that by just consuming ethanol. And by continually having the ethanol poison within them, they continually feel stable. So they wake up, they drink, they feel stable. They drink all day until they go to sleep, feel stable. And that's alcoholism. It's an intolerance to yeast. Their body's craving the ethanol. That's what their mind has tricked them into thinking. When the body's actually craving sugars for the can you see what's happening? So that's one form of yeast intolerance. And then there's the other form, which I've explained already, is the manic depression. Very often these people are rejected by society, and very often a lot of them resort to crime, either through poverty or through loneliness or through sheer psychological breakdowns. Huge proportions of Western culture's criminals, people in jail, are suffering from psychological problems, and a huge proportion of those people are suffering from the yeast intolerance. This is because society has accepted that we are now tolerant to yeast, despite the fact that all throughout society people are suffering from an intolerance to yeast. And this is probably mainly because of the fact that a lot of people enjoy the alcohol industry. A lot of people don't like to admit that the alcohol industry can crush people's lives and destroy families and stuff like that, because everybody's out looking out for themselves, and it's the same as most diseases. A lot of people don't focus on cancer and HIV/AIDS until it affects someone close to them, or until it affects them. It's the same for most things within society. Very often people won't think about the issues of homosexuality until there's a member of their family who admits that they are homosexual, and it's only then that people start to focus on the issues that are close to them. But when it comes to intolerance to yeast and alcoholism and stuff, a lot more people are comfortable to just reject those people, to just push them into the corner, to push them into the pub, to push them onto the streets, to push them into the hospitals, to push them into the prisons, and sort of just forget about them and say, well, they had chances at life and they messed up because they drank alcohol, it's their own fault. And when people say, well, I'm a functioning alcoholic, I'm trying to make my life better, people say, okay, great, you've got your community support team, but that's just the way society has begun to look at yeast intolerance. But now that it's becoming more of a plague, with mental health increasing worldwide, a lot more people are beginning to focus on mental health and say there has to be a cure, because soon the amount of sick and the amount of people dependent on government support and the amount of people dependent on family support is going to overweigh the amount of people supporting, paying the taxes, paying for the supports. As the levels of suicide amongst youngsters and young adults is increasing, and as the behavior of the youth begins to become more aggressive and manic and depressed and unhappy and hurting themselves and stuff, a lot more people are beginning to try and focus and observe and understand why manic depression and abuses of narcotics and things is becoming so severe. So what can we do to help ourselves and help people who are suffering? And I say we have to help ourselves, because if we don't help the people suffering, we're going to end up paying for it in time. If not us, then our children or our grandchildren are going to be burdened by a society of people suffering from mental health and criminality, and society won't be able to cope, and there's going to be some drastic choices that need to be made unless people start to act now to change the ways for the better. And the obvious thing, and the most obvious thing to do is for people to start to educate each other and educate their children about intolerance to yeast, especially in an age of multiculturalism where a lot more children are going to have diverse lineages. As people's genetics becomes more widely distributed and more susceptible as people become more susceptible genetically to yeast intolerance, it's going to affect more and more people. So the first and most obvious reaction to this information is that people need to be educated about the intolerance to yeast. Yeast needs to be, like with glucose and lactose, it needs to be given an intolerance and accepted as an intolerance. People need to see that intolerance and warn each other against it. And at the same time, the industries that rely on those products need to advertise into their market, with their markets that their produce may cause suicide and may cause ill health if people have an intolerance to the ingredients. And that then leads me to the legal and sort of state control regarding the produce of yeast-based products. And it's very obvious to me what people will do. Some people will panic within the markets that they'll lose